first with the films, which will show you drone footage of 3 of the sites that have arsenic poles for mounting solar panels, and all of them are in Carver. 2 of them are the Pine Gate Renewable Solar sites on Rochester Road and Tremont Street, about 100 acres. The 3rd site is on Pond Street, the A.D. Makepeace and Renewable Energy Development Partners site, where 1 mile of solar canopy and ground-mounted dual-use solar are being built. So let's start with the first site, Pine Gate Renewables Rochester Road site.
Then do you want me to turn the lights down a little bit?
Sure.
Yes.
Great, thanks. These are pictures were taken in September, if I have the date right. At the time, construction was underway, and you can see some of the new mats that were being put down for the pile drivers to install the arsenic poles into the granite box.
Yep, September 20th.
September 20th, thanks. You can see the vast water reservoirs surrounding the sites and the earth removal that's been associated with these projects.
That pond looks like it needs testing. That brown pond.
I think that's all for Rochester Road.
Okay.
So Tremont Street?
Sure. This is another Pine Gate Renewable site where poles were started to be installed in about August of 2021. There's a lot more that you can see with this drone footage than what's visible from the street.
Oh, the video, I don't edit by that. This is from later, I forget which shape. It's sometime in October.
Okay.
Is that the Lithium-Ion across the street? Lithium-Ion River?
This was all done within 2 months. Okay.
Yeah,
Yes,
oh,
sir.
are you-
If you don't mind.
Oh, sorry, yeah, sorry, I didn't know the answer to whether it was 2 months. So
okay.
Swan Hole?
Okay, yes, and so this is at the A.D. Makepeace and Renewable Energy Development Partners project. Again, 1 mile of solar canopy will be built along the agricultural bogs. There's also been earth removal here, and land is being cleared to create a dual-use farm project. We don't actually have footage of the prototype that has been constructed, but recent photographs show the poles stacked up along the agricultural canal ready to be installed. Actually, that looks like it was in. Yeah,
These are
here
the
you
poles,
can see
yeah.
the
the
poles.
There's some poles there,
Yeah.
I see. What was there before the scraping?
An Atlantic white cedar swamp and pine barrens forest.
And historical 8,000 to 9,000 years of Native American cremation burials and indigenous sites for 9,000 years.
Yes, it's
occupation.
very
There
significant.
was a dig there, and many digs there, documented digs. The documents are at Mass Archaeological Society, and cremation burial goods were taken out of there. All those hills have been removed. So we're putting someone's Sanders, trucks and removed. Shame on the state for allowing that to happen.
Okay, so I think that's good for the drone, and we can put up our first slide. Again, about who we are and how to get in touch with us. We are Save Pine Barrens, and this is the name of our presentation here. Our agenda, again, to repeat, is the videos, myself, and then Maggie, and then we'll end with a Q&A. As you probably know, and if you don't, these poles that we're concerned about are treated with copper chromated arsenic, which is a toxic pesticide that leaches from wood. It's water soluble, and it's entering our groundwater and our soil. I'll discuss how ratepayer and taxpayer subsidies for solar projects are subsidizing these projects and how this is happening in our local communities. So the subsidies are from ratepayers and taxpayers. They are funneled through the Department of Energy Resources, or DOER, which is a state agency underneath our Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Katie Theo-Hardes, who reports directly to Governor Baker. In recent years, they have put out a solar subsidy program. They're calling them the Smart Solar Regulations. And two of the projects that we are concerned about, the two Buying Gate projects and many others in Carver and throughout southeastern Mass, are called what they call dual use or agrivoltaics. The regulations of the DOER require the continuation of existing farming and recording of crop yields for solar panel sites where crops are being grown under the panels. So the land under the panels must be used for some sort of agriculture. The DOER regulations have different levels of subsidies, and in order to maximize your subsidies, it's often done that the companies will use some of these creative things like putting solar panels on top of cranberry bogs. The cranberry industry itself admits that this is experimental and no one really knows whether the crops will grow underneath the solar panels. The process is such that the Department of Energy Resources pre-approves the projects, issues a pre-qualification letter from the landowner and the solar company, and they have approved the projects that we're concerned about in Carver today. The dual-use projects have to have an approved farm plan. However, according to our research, many projects, including one in Carver on Gate Street, have been built, are operating, but have no farm plan. The DOER administers the subsidy program using taxpayer money. The Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, which is based at UMass, works with solar developers to do research to justify growing crops under solar panels. For example, the UMass Cranberry Extension Program has a $1 million grant to study use on cranberry bogs to see if the crops will grow under the panels. In the meantime, we're building these projects. In Carver, we have these three projects, $55 million in arsenic poles being installed for a 30-year period, even though there's no evidence that the crops will grow underneath them. And we are asking, is this really the way to help cranberry farmers in southeastern Mass? Or should the subsidies go directly to the farmers themselves instead of into these research programs and out-of-state corporations? The UMass study of growing crops on prime farmland in western Mass and Northfield shows that a 40 to 60% lower crop yield. So in that particular case in western Mass, a 120-acre solar project on prime farmland the company Blue Wave has decided to raise goats instead of raising crops and food. And this is a far lower economic return for farmers than growing high-priced products like strawberries. And this is one reason why, for example, the Northampton, Massachusetts Agricultural Commission is opposed to dual use on prime agricultural land. And we have many resources on our table, including that statement recently issued by the Northampton Agricultural Commission. In Carver, taxpayers and ratepayers are subsidizing the research that's going on to try to justify growing cranberries underneath the Pine Gate renewable projects in our backyard that we just saw. Again, there's 100 acres, and it's a big experiment. The AD Makepeace project on Swanhold is another type of incentive program under the state's SMART regulations. The 1 mile of solar canopy in the cranberry bog and in the groundwater is called a solar canopy. The money from ratepayers and taxpayers is channeled to the solar developers through our electric rates. The SMART is called a tariff-based program. Again, the DOER approves the solar project and tells the utilities such as Eversource that it has to buy this so-called renewable energy in order to sell electricity in Massachusetts, guaranteeing the solar companies a market for the products. Despite all of this state involvement in approving and vetting these projects, the state has refused to take any action with regard to the citizens' concerns here in Carver about these arsenic holes. In October, we specifically asked the Department of Energy Resources to provide some assistance to the town and to the community to address this toxic hole situation, and they explicitly said that it was the town's problem. These solar projects in Carver and elsewhere, large ground-mounted solar projects, are evading environmental review under our Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act. I can go into the legal reasons for that, but I won't bore you with that. We've been bringing this to their attention. Basically, the state is shoveling money out the door to out-of-state corporations to take advantage of these taxpayer and ratepayer subsidies and refusing to take any responsibility for the side effects, whether it's deforestation, loss of farmland, or in this case, arsenic holes that are polluting our groundwater. The Carver Conservation Commission and Planning Board approved these projects in about 2019. Neither AD Makepeace nor Pine Gate Renewables disclosed the use of the copper chromated arsenic in their permit applications to these two local boards based on records that we have obtained and posted on our website. When local residents saw the poles going up on Tremont Street or Rochester Road this summer and saw them clearly labeled copper chromated arsenic, they raised alarms. It wasn't until mid-September that the Carver Conservation Commission responded. To our knowledge, the Carver Planning Board has not taken any action whatsoever. And again, the state has done nothing to respond to anyone's concerns, whether it's the Department of Environmental Protection, who's responsible for protection of our water supply, and certainly not the Department of Energy Resources. As folks may know, a stop work order was issued by the Conservation Commission in early 2021 for 2 of the 3 projects in place, but AD Makepeace and the Swanhold project, that's a $2 million project, is not under a stop work order, and no one has given us an explanation for that. In our view, these projects exemplify Governor Baker's reckless solar policy that has caused so far 4,000 acres or more to be forest to be clear cut, and for our prime agricultural land to be used for solar projects. 150,000 more acres are planned to be clear cut or farm land planned to be used under the state's climate plan. Along with Mass Audubon and many other organizations who have signed on to a letter that's also over there, this is not the way to address the climate crisis. Specifically here in Carver, we demand an objective state study by qualified independent experts on the concentrations of CCA that's leaching and its long-term migration in the groundwater and soil. We're demanding that the projects file new applications for permit modifications with the Carver Conservation Commission, the Planning Board, and that public hearings be conducted according to those permit applications. There's no way to fix this. The poles cannot be treated or encapsulated or otherwise mitigated. The poles must be removed and the land must be restored. And now I will introduce our next speaker, Maggie Van Gagle.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, I'm Maggie Van Gagle. I am a resident of Carver, and my background is in environmental health and disease, and I'm specifically studying the effects of environmental toxicants on human health. So today I'm going to speak to you and kind of debrief a little bit on the science and what the scientific literature, the peer-reviewed scientific literature says about our problem here in Carver with these CCA-treated poles. So my talk will cover a little bit of what CCA is, the history of CCA, why it leaches, how it leaches, and the different models and scientific research that shows that this leaching happens and what the potential implications are for human health and the health of our aquifer. Next slide. So arsenic, basically what is chromium copper arsenic and why is it used? Meg alluded to this. CCA, as I'll call it from here on, is a pesticide, and it's a solution or a mixture that is applied to wood as a pressure treatment, or what's commonly called pressure treating of wood. It is basically a fungicide, and it stops the degradation of these poles in wet, damp environments to inhibit what is typically seen with normal untreated pressure treated wood, normal untreated wood. So it's called pressure treated because it's applied under pressure conditions, but it is a water-soluble mixture. That's how it's delivered into the poles, and what that means is it can leach out of the poles when they're in a water-containing solution, an aqueous solution. So the scientific literature is clear, and we'll get into some of that, but CCA readily leaches into the environment. So what that, again, CCA is a mixture of copper salts, chromium salts, and arsenic salts. And depending on the environment, as literature shows, we see different leaching of different metals in different environments. So we'll talk today about arsenic in particular because that is our concern here, given our soil chemistry, the geology, and our weather patterns here, and also the use of these poles. Next slide, please. So with our focus on arsenic today, arsenic is, yes, a naturally occurring compound. That's not at all in contention here. The problem with what we're dealing with is, number one, the form of arsenic, which we'll talk about in a moment. Arsenic itself is a very well-studied, well-documented, and known carcinogen as documented by the US EPA. It is implicated in a lot of different diseases and adverse health outcomes. It's a known carcinogen. It leads to, depending on the route of exposure, bladder cancer, liver cancer, skin cancers. It is implicated in cardiovascular disease, diabetes. It is a nasty compound. It's historically been used for poisonings, and it, again, is a naturally occurring compound, but we are using it in a very unnatural way in this installation in Carver. So numerous adverse health effects and outcomes, they range, they carry really the gamut because it is a persistent, nasty toxicant. Next page. So arsenic chemistry, you'll hear a lot, and if you dive into the scientific literature yourself, you're going to hear a couple common words. Some of them, really, it comes down to arsenic is the element that we're dealing with, and it is part of all of these different forms. It takes different forms in the environment depending on the chemistry. That really can be broken down into two major components. inorganic arsenic, which is what we're going to talk about today, and organic arsenic. So basically what the arsenic is bound to. So inorganic salts are what we're talking about today, and there's two forms. I will call them from here on out arsenic 5 or arsenic 3. They're also commonly referred to as pentavalent arsenic or trivalent arsenic, and it refers to basically how many electrons the atom has going into it. We are going to discuss the difference between AS5 and AS3, but our primary concern is both of those. Arsenic 3 is more toxic and more mobile in the environment, and it is a critical concern for us. It is a common environmental pollutant and something that we really need to watch. It is implicated far more often in the adverse health effects that we showed previously. So we'll move on from there. So next slide, we'll focus on these guys. So you'll see this as depicted on some upcoming graphics as AS3+, that's the trivalent form, or AS5+, which is the pentavalent form. Okay, we can go to the next slide. That's just an example, sorry.
Yeah.
That's my animations, I had to have them in. So what happens under normal use? And this is well studied in the scientific literature in short-term studies. So a couple months, couple years. There's not a lot of studies out there that look at the lifetime and leaching of this compound over 30, 40 years, which is, for everyone's point of reference, the length of time of this project, the expected lifetime of the solar project in Carver. So under a normal environment, we have my drawings of telephone poles here. You typically see 6 to 10 feet of a telephone pole buried in the environment in normal use, and they're fairly well spaced out. So what happens, depending on the environment and depending on the acidity of the rainfall and the water around it, these metals will leach from the poles, and that enters the rainfall, it can enter the soil, and then wherever that rain goes, that can be carried along. So these ions, you'll see AS5+, you'll see copper 2+, AS5+, 3+. Those are all just representative images of all the different ions that we're concerned about with CCA in particular. So when placed in saturated conditions, so in a damp, wet environment, the scientific literature is clear, these metals leach more. And when placed in an acidic, wet environment, arsenic and copper both leach very, very well. Numerous scientific studies have showed that. There are studies that show that on not just telephone poles or pilings, like what we're dealing with here in Carver, but also on playgrounds. And this leaching is the primary reason that the EPA banned CCA-treated wood for residential use in 2003, and it is no longer allowed in residential use. We are dealing with this in Carver because this is an quote-unquote industrial application. So it's still approved through the EPA with correct safety concerns and precautions for use in industrial settings right now. Let me go to the next slide. So some more depth into the literature. There's extensive studies. Again, not a lot of them have looked at projects, but leaching has clearly been demonstrated, and the amount of metal that leaches, so arsenic, copper, and chromium are all metals, the amount that leaches is dependent on the environment. It is clear that in acidic conditions and wet conditions, arsenic is our primary concern, which is exactly based on the soil cores that were obtained from the Pine Gate projects, exactly what we're dealing with. An acidic solution of a pH around 4 to 5, and organic, soily, wet samples. So in acidic environments, what happens is the arsenic that is used to treat these poles is a form called pentavalent arsenic. When it leaches, it stays as pentavalent arsenic, which we'll cover in a minute, and then transfers and undergoes a reduction to arsenic 3, which is far more mobile, far more water soluble, and far more toxic, more bioavailable for the human body to do something with and put it somewhere it doesn't belong. You can go to the next slide. So in this model, I've taken the model of the poles just to describe this process, and we can see we have a cranberry bog here with berries growing. In our case, in Carver, these poles are not being buried 6 or 10 feet deep. They're being buried to a depth of 40 feet, which means more surface area for to come in contact with water, which means more leaching. So they're gonna leach more heavily, and it's the evidence is clear. Higher rainfall, higher amounts of water means more leaching. We end up with all of these ions entering into the surrounding soil, the groundwater depicted here in blue, and potentially making it into runoff. You can go to the next slide. We also have the transition in very acidic environments of arsenic 5 to arsenic 3, the more toxic form. This is just a depiction showing that as rain increases, this will also increase this leaching. And then the final image is what happens during cranberry production or harvesting, where the bogs and these bogs are going to be flooded for harvesting. So that means in addition to all the debris that's fallen off these poles through the driving process, pile driving process, through just natural deterioration, all that sediment and all that debris lands in the bogs, that then ends up getting into the water where more arsenic leaches, more compounds dissolve, and then that water is pumped to a different bog or to a different reservoir. This is why this is such a concern. It's not just that bog. The groundwater aquifer in southeastern Mass is sole source. That means once it's contaminated, that's it. You can go to the next slide. So this is an interesting study. This is one of the few studies that shows what happens as these projects age. So this particular study was actually done in Bridgewater, Massachusetts, our lovely little neighbor, a couple towns over. And it was done looking at playground equipment, but with the same type of wood and CCA treatment, looking at how much compound, how much arsenic leaches over a period of, this was surveyed at 16 years post-install and 26 years. So this isn't, I do not make the case that this is a like-for-like assessment, because these are not buried and saturated, but what you see is that over time, you see actually an increase. So the light bars here on all of these graphs are at 16 years. The darker bars are at 26. We see an increase over time in the amount of arsenic that is readily available in the soil, detected in the soil. And if you take a look at what the Massachusetts state safe limit is for arsenic in soil, it's 20 parts per million. We're well over that on most of those things. This again is the reason that this is no longer used in playgrounds. It's no longer used in residential settings. So, and it's this, the beauty of this study is that this is very similar climate to us. So a lot of the studies around copper chromated arsenic look at studies in Florida and tropical settings, and you see a lot of leaching there. But we see it plenty here too. Next slide. So the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission recommends that if you are going to come into contact with copper or CCA treated poles, that you use safe handling guidelines. You encapsulate them if possible. You treat them. You basically don't use them is the number one. And it's not possible for this project to encapsulate these. They're already driven in. They've done the damage. They're there, and they're continuing to leach compounds, including arsenic, into our water. The lifetime for this project is 40 years, so typically if there are older playgrounds, for example, like the example in Bridgewater, the town is supposed to go out and treat those to keep the leaching from happening. It basically forms like a water protective barrier to slow the leaching down so that it doesn't get into the soil, get into kids with increased hand-to-mouth interaction. We can't do that. So again, this is just an experimental project. There are alternates. It's easy, you can use steel. That was the original plan for these projects. That does not leach arsenic. So it's a very dangerous project. It's endangering the berry business. So it's endangering our economics, it's endangering our drinking water and our human health and safety, and it's endangering the environment. One more slide. So overall, it's clear, the evidence is clear and compelling that CCA leaches from wood. Anybody that says otherwise hasn't looked at the scientific literature. Next, let me just rattle through them. Arsenic is a concern, again, due to our climate and our geology here and the content of those peat bogs. Sorry, arsenic negatively impacts human health at low concentrations, very low concentrations. That is well known, well documented, and it does get into food crops, including rice. A huge problem in southeastern Asia. Increased exposure to wet and acidic environments increases the amount of bioavailable arsenic, so it increases the leaching and then increases the conversion from arsenic 5 to arsenic 3. The next one. and safety precautions used in other industries to help safeguard workers and the general public cannot be used in this project and have not been used in this project. And again, this threatens our environmental health, our safety, and the sole source of drinking water for over 150,000 people in southeastern Mass.
Thank you very much, Dr. And next, we have Nicole Thomas, who again lives on Rochester Road here in Carver, and she'll explain her situation.
I've lived in this town for 17 years, and I've actually helped to harvest the very bogs we are discussing. I walk on bogs with my dogs, my children bike ride, fish, and also walk on bogs. To make this not long and drawn out, but I'll explain how every bogs work. Bog owners take the water from a shared water source, and they flood the bog halfway. Then they have a machine that churns the berries to have them fall off the vines. They're mixing berries and water all together. Then they add more water, corral the berries into a circle, drop a box, and then they pump the berries out, and they take out weeds, vines, frogs, turtles, snakes, and then they bring the berries to the plant. When they are done, they then return the water back into their water source, whether it's a pond, a water hole where the neighboring bog owner will then use the same water on their bog. And the cycle keeps going on and on and on for years and years. In front of me, I have a jar of berries. Half of the berries were grown 6 inches from the poles. Which ones are they? And who wants to eat the ones that I'm discussing? Also, from driving these poles into the ground are the bits of the CCA poles throughout the vines and the bogs that are left behind. And this is just a small amount of what's left behind. These chromated copper arsenate poles was the cheapest alternative for putting up these panels in the bogs. We all know this is a $52 million project with more coming up. As we saw from the revised agenda from October 20th, Zero Pond Street was slated to discuss timber poles as well. And who knows how many more there are to possibly come to us as well. Pine Gate Renewables stated at the last meeting that they are our neighbors and they wanted to hear our concerns. I think the answer is to do the solar project the right way without any health concerns to people, food, water, soil, and the environment. In Law School 101, you can take any fact and use it to your advantage, or you can use it to your disadvantage. Yet here we sit here, we say 75% of the bog will be fine, and will not have CCA in the soil and the water. You can also take the exact same fact and turn around and say 25% will be contaminated. Bottom line is the risk should be zero and not in a hypothesis or with the use of the residents as guinea pigs. The fact that we have to sit here and even discuss that there is only a percentage or a chance, an ideal situation, I find this to be rather appalling. We're talking about people, households who have to drink the water from the wells. Their wells are 20, 30, 40 feet in the ground, and these bowls are 20, 30, 40 feet into the ground. Last meeting, Pine Gate geologists and scientists knowingly stated that with rain and the treatment of the poles, that 2 by 2 feet of every pole, the soil and the water will be contaminated with CCA, with 3,100 poles already placed. In turn, this is in their ideal conditions. They are saying they are contaminating 3,100 cubic yards of soil and cranberries. It was also noted by them that acidic and wet conditions will accelerate release of chemicals. This soil, when removed, will be seen as a hazardous waste along with the poles. Tremont Street site also abuts the Wee Antic. Let's say the poles get left in and we test the water every 6 to 12 months. We test the soil every 12 months, test the berries every harvest, and we find out in 2, 3, 5, 7 years down the road, yeah, this was the worst thing that we could have done. So where does that leave us? By then, we've all had our kids, our family, our neighbors in South Carver drinking the water and exposed for years, and I don't see this as a win. If I were to buy a cornfield in Iowa, I wouldn't walk into their town meeting explaining to them what I feel is best to their residents and corn growers that the CCA poles would be fine in their crops and water if I drove them down 30 feet. And you know why? Because I don't live in Iowa, and honestly, I don't know one thing about how corn works, what they use to treat corn, how to water the corn, and how to pick the corn. Yet here we are, we have Pine Gate Renewables telling us what is best for us in Carver. excuse me, what is best for us in Carver. They don't know anything about cranberries. They've never had a solar project on a cranberry bog. They don't know anything about peat moss or how to harvest. They don't know how the water moves, and they don't know anything about our aquifer. I think this is a no-brainer. The poles come out as soon as possible, and Pine Gate Renewable uses an environmentally responsible method to, yes, this will cost them more, but at the expense of our health and our environment, I don't think it's a cost for us here in Carver. We can give the job back to the people who put the poles in by giving them the job of taking them back out. Thank you, Nicole Thomas.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for your careful attention. We have fact sheets over on the table about a lot of these different issues, and we have about 15, almost 20 minutes for Q&A.
Does someone want to speak to the battery storage proposal and what that impact could be as well?
So these projects that we're talking about, at least two of them, both the Pine Gate projects have battery storage, and then maybe you're also alluding to 150 megawatt battery storage facility that's in front of the Energy Facility Siting Board, also located in Carver on cranberry bogs and on a site that has been strip mined and with all the earth removed. That was part of it. So,
It's actually going to be a budding.
abutting in a residential neighborhood within, I believe, 9/10 of a mile of the Carver Elementary School. This is a very great concern. This is a 150 megawatt lithium-ion battery facility. When a similar facility, I believe, was it half the size or two-thirds the size, a similar Tesla battery energy storage facility in Australia caught on fire this past summer. It took 150 firefighters 4 days to extinguish it. It can't be put out with water. This type of fire requires some kind of encapsulation with like a concrete type material. So there are a lot of questions about that and the safety and why this is being allowed. And if anyone is interested in learning about how to participate in the state level adjudicatory proceeding for that, the comments are due at the end of November. And if you'd like to join and participate in that proceeding, you can do so by contacting the Energy Facility Siting Board, EFSB. The case docket is up on their website, and I'd be happy to talk to you about that more after this meeting.
Could you speak to the toxins that are airborne during that fire?
Do you know anything about lithium-ion battery fires?
Not as expert, but what I can tell you is typically the way that they're put out is using PFOS and PFOA, so perfluoral octanates. And those are known persistent organic compounds that are pollutants that are basically impossible to get rid of, as a lot of people here in Carver know, with the North Carver dumping site. So it's the toxicant exposure through obviously battery fire. I don't have the literature in front of me to speak to that with any type of confidence or knowledge currently. But what I can say is PFAS and PFOAs, as we call them, are really nasty reproductive endocrine disruptors.
And with the battery fire in Australia this summer, the 150 firefighters had to have special respiratory protections. And there also were alarms that were put out to the surrounding neighborhoods so that people could evacuate and have protective equipment themselves. So a big question is, you know, the small town like Carver, how are we going to have an emergency response plan that's adequately funded for like the project, another 20, 30-year project that's going to require, you know, constant training, making sure that the equipment is up to date and the safety first responders are adequately trained.
I believe it was a Midwest lithium battery fire also this summer.
There was in Chicago, yes. And that has resulted, I believe, in lawsuit against the company because the firefighters could not put it out for several days.
Another detail is that they're more frequent in electric cars. And I've heard about them in the news, and the frequency is increasing because there are more electric cars. And that's a very serious concern. Nicole, I had a question, well, I had a statement. You know, you talk about the people in South Carver, and I understand that. It's, you know, I wouldn't want to be living where you're living right now, and I would want to be you fighting. But I have to say that the water, the aquifer doesn't recognize where it begins or where, I'm not quite sure of the flow of the aquifer, and that's one thing maybe you can help with, but, you know, this is our town's issue as well.
I can talk a little bit about the Plymouth Cover Sole Source Aquifer. I do have a copy here of the report from a couple of years ago by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs that the town of Carver supported and signed on to. It gives a lot of detail about the flow direction. It does show that 99% of Carver's water comes from the aquifer, 99% of Plymouth's water comes from the aquifer. Other towns, the other 7 towns, the 150,000 people, have additional other water supplies, but it was designated by the US EPA in 1990 as a sole source aquifer, and EPA did that because it recognized that due to the permeable soils and the area that it covered, that it was highly susceptible to contamination and needed to be protected because it was the sole source aquifer as, you know, for these communities. And that's a federal law, the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. And it was a petition by the town of Plymouth and a local citizen group that resulted in the designation of the Plymouth Carver Sole Source Aquifer under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act.
I have just something to say. This morning at 6:30 this morning, and I shared this with a couple of you, I saw a pied-bill grebe, and I haven't seen one in a long time, and 2 bald eagles. And I think we need to speak a little bit towards the environment itself. They were 4 minutes away on a Google map from Tremont Street to Sampson Pond. Water travels so fast, and our birds fly, and our fish swim, and our turtles, and they are drinking and eating fish from these bodies of water. I actually, a couple of years ago, for my job, needed credits and had a wonderful doctor from Sinai Hospital in New York City. And it was all about toxicities in the body due to chemicals in our environment. Women in utero, 9/11, first responders, and shows exactly what happens to our body, and it devastated me to see. I mean, I'm an AOLCP, so I'm an accredited organic landscape professional. I was wondering, why are they sending us doctor to this conference? But I was so glad to see what actually happens to the human body when toxic chemicals like this get into us. So I think we need to think about how fast the water flows, where it's going. I know it's been manipulated over the last 100 years. Dams put up by the cranberry industry. Fish stop moving because they can't get up the dams. But I think we really need to talk about, we have so many fishermen out there in those boats on Sampson Pond all the time. And we need to think about this arsenic problem.
So maybe Maggie could talk a little bit about the effects of CCA on aquatic species.
Yep, so what I can speak to is the fact that often these heavy metals, part of the reason for their toxicity is that they, depending on the metal, like to replace things that our bodies actually need. So in the case of, say, rice paddies in Southeast Asia, a common contaminant there is cadmium, which replaces calcium, and it results in brittle bone disease. What I can say is chromium is a known aquatic toxic, or toxic pollutant, and it's a known accumulator in fish in particular. And depending on where you are in the country, one of the things that you'll often see are things like advisories against eating smallmouth bass, one of the common fun fish to catch. So that happens because the small plankton, the small organisms that live in the sediment uptake heavy metals in general, and then that bioaccumulates up the food chain, just like every other persistent pollutant, like PCBs, PFOAs are the same. So it's, in this case, no different. We do see bioaccumulation often in these compounds, with the compounds that we're talking about, both arsenic, chromium, and copper. And it happens, and it's toxic. It can disrupt plants, and vegetation. It can be uptaken by, or taken up by those plants and vegetation. It can be taken up by animals and metabolized by animals.
Maggie, one quick thing is that I know that I tend to watch what fish, what they're regulating in fish in ponds and so forth around lakes around here, but where the Lithium-Ion flows directly into Buzzards Bay, and I know that these poles are not able to be used, generally speaking, in coastal areas. How do we know that this arsenic isn't flowing into Buzzards Bay? The Lithium-Ion it moves. It's going right out into Buzzards Bay. So, this is just a question of mine to people who are regulating this. I mean, I don't understand how it was even a thought.
I don't know exactly the safe limits for, or the limits for that kind of non-anthropomorphic arsenic in Buzzards Bay, but there are several Superfund sites along Buzzards Bay, in the 195 corridor. All of New Bedford Harbor is a Superfund site, mostly due to PCB contamination, but also heavy metals. It's not an uncommon thing in Massachusetts, that, and New England as a whole, that we're pretty familiar with Superfund sites here. I can't speak exactly what our regulations are in Massachusetts for arsenic in Buzzards Bay or any major bodies of water. I don't know.
We should stop.
I can say that, we do have a history of concerns about aquatic species and birds that forage in cranberry bog canals. People who have been around for a while, like me, will recall the study that Management Center for Conservation Studies did on the impacts to night herons that were foraging in cranberry bog canals, and linking that to the pesticides that we used in the bogs, because the birds had lower hatch numbers and whatnot. So, adding anything else like arsenic into the water where we know the wildlife lives, where we know the frogs are, where we know there's a food chain and people are out fishing and the fish have eaten the plankton and whatnot. It's been a concern here for a number of years, and why would we want to add any more poisonous toxins to our water?
And the complications of mixtures are well documented and well studied, just in general. Probably need more study, but there are plenty of studies out there looking, again, at Superfund sites, because they tend to have lots of mixtures of toxicants. So.
Another question? Oh, I'm sorry, Annie?
Yeah. I'm connecting the fact that cranberries are a very acidic fruit, correct? And that's why they add 36 grams of sugar, and I wouldn't let my kid drink cranberry juice as a child. I didn't know it was not healthy until I read the 36 grams. But how does that affect the drawing of the arsenic perhaps into the fruit, because it's and does it, and because it's more acidic, is it a whole other compounding effect?
Yeah, there's actually, I looked into this, I was not able to find much published research on the effect of arsenic on an uptake in the specific primary. There is a study from 1979 that looked at the accumulation of arsenic in Maine wild blueberries, which are in the same, I believe in the same genus as Blueberries vaccinium. And they did accumulate in the foliage and the leaves. I can't remember off the top of my head if and how it was measured in the berries. That is a dated study. There were additional studies found elsewhere, but nothing specific calling out cranberries that I'm aware of, that I was able to find.
Okay, it's 4:58, and maybe we have time for one or two more questions? Okay, if not, thank you very much. We're happy to answer any questions. Feel free to email us. We have flyers over there with our contact information. Go to our website, which we're still adding information to. We're just getting ourselves off the ground. We also have information on the Save the Pine Barren site. We've been trying to provide as much documentation as we can about this so people can see the permits, see the reports that are being put out, just trying to have some access to information for folks so they can learn about this. And, we certainly urge people to get involved.